Well, it looks like it's 6:30, so I'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. My name is Lori Lopez. I'm a professor in communication arts and director of the Asian American Studies program at UW-Madison. And today I'll be talking about how Asian Americans have fought for better representation. So I'll start with a little background information about me. I've been at UW-Madison for 9 years, and I'm originally from Portland, Oregon. And the focus of my research and my teaching are race and media. So my research has specifically focused on Asian Americans and the different ways that Asian American communities have used media in the fight for social justice. I'm fourth generation Japanese American, so it's been really important for me to think about how racism is upheld, but also how we can imagine and work toward a better world. So that is what I'll be talking about today. I've got a little outline for my presentation. First, I'll start with kind of a really basic introduction to Asian American issues, including what kind of terminology to use when talking about Asian Americans, and then what stereotypes we have seen of Asian Americans in media. Then I'll talk about the connection between those stereotypes and this really crazy surge in anti-Asian violence that we have seen, especially in the last year during the COVID pandemic. And then I'll get into this media activism issue, how Asian Americans have organized to change these messages and hope to try to improve Asian American media representation. Okay. So let's start with the basics. I wanted to talk a little bit about the terms that we use for describing Americans of Asian and Pacific Islander descent, just because these terms do change all the time. And I know it can be kind of confusing to stay on top of the whole thing. So I'll start with Asian American. The term Asian American was coined during the Yellow Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s, and it's a deliberate move away from the term Oriental, which was the much more common term for talking about Americans of Asian descent. That term was understood as pejorative. It felt like a word that you would use to describe a rug and sort of connoted the mystical, magical East from the perspective of white people. So the term Asian American was celebrated as something that the community decided for itself. And as we know, self-determination is really important for all minority groups. It also marked the beginning of an Asian American political consciousness, and that cut across a bunch of different Asian ethnic groups. So before that, someone might say oh, I'm Japanese American or I'm Filipino American, but it was important to say in this moment that they were all being treated as Orientals. So we should come together as a political unit and fight for our civil rights. So that's what the Asian American movement was all about in this time period. So this term Asian American is very politically significant, and it remains really commonly used today. I'm the director of the Asian American Studies program at UW-Madison. I identify as Asian American. Sometimes journalists, or historically journalists, had used a hyphen between Asian and American. We have very recently fought to get rid of the hyphen. And even style guides now say don't use the hyphen because Asian Americans felt like it was saying there was a division between the Asian and American parts of our identity rather than what we see as a united whole. So that's Asian American. But what about all the additions? I'm sure you're familiar with some of these other terms. For instance, Asian Pacific Islander Americans or Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So the term Pacific Islanders is often added to this category because people from the Pacific Islands are often kind of lumped in with Asian Americans. Of course, people with heritage from Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, Hawaii aren't Asian, so it makes sense to use language that captures them more accurately, like these terms, and then they get turned into API or APIA or AAPI. This is what I'm saying. There's a lot of different terms. I threw in some images of some groups like the Asian Pacific Islanders Caucus or APIA vote. So those are really common terms as well. They're all fine. They're all just trying to signify that we are this big umbrella group that's very much open to all Asians and Pacific Islanders. More recently, we have seen the emergence of this new acronym, APIDA, which stands for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American. And that term Desi refers to South Asians, so people from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. And this term is used to remind people that the Asian umbrella community does not just include East Asians, but a wide assortment of countries and nationalities and backgrounds. On campus, we recently opened the APIDA Student Center. So that acronym APIDA has been quite common on campus, in addition to Asian American. So this might not even cover them all. There might be some other versions of these groups and different identities. I would say they're all just trying to be inclusive and call attention to this minority population. And I think all these terms are fine. None of these terms are offensive or pejorative. They're kind of interchangeable. I would just recommend not using the hyphen. But other than that, I think that people would probably have different arguments for why they prefer one term over another. But I think they're all kind of acceptable terms. Here's another question. What about the rest of Asia? So another part of this issue of terminology and geography is how much of the continent of Asia is included within the term Asian American, of Asian heritage. And of course, Asia is a large continent, includes 48 countries, includes parts of Russia, Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Western Asian countries like Turkey and Iraq and Afghanistan, usually things that we would call the Middle East. So I would say that there are not a lot of definitions of Asian American that include people with heritage from Central and Western Asian countries, but it is important to acknowledge that racial categories are just imperfect. They change all the time. They leave people out. They're confusing. I would say that the most important thing to think about when it comes to these racial categories is this. So I have, what is Asian American? It is an imperfect, flexible, and dynamic racial category that describes an incredibly diverse and heterogeneous community that is experienced being lumped together through racism. So we always have to remember that race is only important because of racism. I just told that history of how Asian Americans decided to come together as a racial group, despite all of the diversity within the group and all of the obvious differences between them, because they were facing prejudice and discrimination and oppression. So Asian Americans have come together in recognition of racism as a way of fighting it. But our communities change and racism changes too. So these terms are always changing, and that's okay. Second, I would say that we should keep asking Americans of Asian and Pacific Islander descent what they prefer to be called and respect their wishes. We should think about what kind of inequities these communities are facing, whose experiences are being left out, what are their goals, what are the best outcomes that they are looking for. I really like the phrase from that the disability rights movement has often used, which is nothing about us without us, right? So always ask people what it is they're experiencing. And I think that's a good reminder for all of these racial issues. So we should keep asking Americans of Asian and Pacific Islander descent what they prefer to be called and respect their wishes. Okay, so now I'd like to turn more fully to the issue of anti-Asian racism. And to get us started, I'm going to talk about stereotypes and the dominant frameworks that have been used to understand Asian Americans. First, I would just say that we have to acknowledge there's a lot of problems of underrepresentation. Asian Americans commonly feel invisible, and that plays out in all sorts of different arenas. How few Asian American political representatives we have, how few Asian Americans we see in powerful positions in this world, and other leadership roles, and then in media representations, which I'll be talking about a lot. So how rarely we see Asian Americans represented in movies and TV shows, but also news media journalism. When we do see representation, there are some pretty worrisome tropes that tend to predominate. So I'm going to walk us through these. First, we've got yellow peril, the fear that Asians are threatening to overpower or take over the US. So this is one of the most common frameworks for how Asians have been understood. This is a pretty historical framework. It extends back hundreds of years to this fear where the Orient has always been portrayed as kind of dark and mysterious and magical in comparison to the Occident, right? So the Orient is the East and the Occident is the West. And the Orient is always threatening to overpower the Occident. So this historical framing is actually intersecting with national interests at the turn of the century, because in the US, we had thousands of Chinese who had began immigrating to the US to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. And like so many non-white immigrants today, Chinese immigrants were not accepted as hard workers or potential American citizens. Instead, they were seen as unintelligent, immoral, diseased, violent, uncivilized, and basically just totally separate from regular Americans. There's a lot of fear that Chinese immigrants were going to steal jobs from white people. And that is why they were eventually banned from immigrating through the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this was a policy that lasted from 1868 to 1943. But we also saw this fear of Asians in fictional oops, I don't have that. Let's go back here to these fictional representations like Fu Manchu. So we've got this evil Chinese villain who's always plotting to take over the world. And Fu Manchu was in tons of movies and TV shows and books, and he is always represented as diabolical and sinister and evil. Today, there are still a lot of lingering fears that we call Cynophobia. So fears around things like Chinatowns are dirty and diseased. We have also seen a lot of Cynophobia around COVID-19, but also in just kind of like age-old criticisms that Chinese restaurants are unsafe. Or we can think about like the panics around children's toys having lead in them if they're manufactured in China. All this stuff about like, oh, we should boycott things that are made in China. So all this turns into this sentiment, maybe you should go back to China where you belong. A lot of anti-Chinese sentiment and kind of fear mongering around this yellow peril discourse. Asian Americans are also often portrayed as just foreigners. We call them either the perpetual foreigner or the forever foreigner. They can never fully assimilate to American society and will always be an outsider who cannot understand American culture. So the perpetual foreigner stereotype basically says they will always be separated from real Americans. And sometimes that's funny. Like we see lots of jokes about how Asian Americans are so different. I would say this stereotype is based in some reality, right? There are many Asian immigrants to the US. I think the majority of Asians living in the US right now are immigrants, they're first generation immigrants. So maybe they do have an accent, and maybe they did come to this country and experience culture shock, or maybe they're just here to go to school and do have plans to return home to whatever country they immigrated from. But we shouldn't make fun of them for that. And just because they speak with an accent doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they belong here. Many Asians speak with accents because they're actually multilingual and or maybe are experiencing racism, and that is what is so disruptive to their life in this country. The stereotype is obviously also harmful for just lumping all Asian people who look Asian as being the same, saying that just because you look a certain way, you must be an outsider who can never belong. And I have this question, where are you really from? So the one pretty common experience for all Asians is that when people ask you, where are you from? And you say like Portland, Oregon or whatever, people don't know where are you really from. And they just like need to know this like origin story because they just assume you cannot be from here. Let's look at this other stereotype, the model minority. So the stereotype of the model minority is kind of a contemporary version of the yellow peril stereotype. It's also a fear that Asians are going to take over the US, but instead of being scared of warfare or military conflict, the model minority is the fear of Asians taking over colleges or taking over companies, or basically just competing with white American kids at everything and being better at them than them. So this is the idea that Asians have this drive to excel and that they've been held up as the minority group that is successful. So this sometimes comes from statistics showing that Asian Americans are disproportionately more wealthy than other minority groups or more educated. And we can see this stereotype upheld in the media through representations like these, where Asians are very commonly depicted as like doctors or scientists or psychologists or forensic psychologists or tech experts, lawyers, these kinds of jobs. Asian men are often depicted as nerds because of this. I've got Andrew Yang up here. He annoys a lot of Asian Americans because he really feeds into this stereotype without questioning how harmful it has been. So the origins of the stereotype are, again, rooted in some reality. There are reasons why we have this stereotype. It's because we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which meant that no Chinese, or like a very small quota of Chinese, could immigrate to the United States. Then the doors to immigration from Asia opened up in 1965 with the 1965 Immigration Act. And it opened the doors specifically to immigrants who are highly educated or who worked in certain fields where there were labor shortages, like healthcare, science, and information industries. Those industries needed workers, and so this policy prioritized certain kinds of Asian immigrants, and it deeply shaped the demographics of our country by allowing thousands of highly educated immigrants from China and South Korea and India to come to the US. So there's reasons why we see a lot of highly educated Asian Americans who work in tech fields or like healthcare fields. And when we deny that history or ignore it, it may seem like Asians are just naturally gifted in those fields, or that Asians are just disproportionately like inclined toward these kinds of jobs or positions, or they're doing well in school. But that's just a historical artifact of a certain immigration policy. And furthermore, that's only a small percentage of Asians who came to this country, because there are actually many reasons why Asians immigrated to this country, including, for instance, refugees from the Vietnam War. So there's many reasons why Asians immigrated to this country that don't have anything to do with their education level. Another problem with the model minority myth is that it pits minority groups against each other. So it makes it seem like, why can't Black and Brown immigrants or communities in the US succeed when you have Asian Americans who are doing so well? So Asians are seen as this wedge group between whites and other minority groups, which is really problematic. Actually, Asian Americans are in solidarity with Black and Brown people of color. It also covers up the actual struggles that Asian American communities are facing. So Asian Americans absolutely suffer from poverty and educational access issues, health issues, deportations, mental health issues, political struggles. So it's a really big problem when you have this model minority stereotype and it seems positive, like Asian Americans are doing so well, but then it makes Asian Americans feel like they can't ask for help, or like there's something wrong with them if they're struggling. So it really detracts from the ability of Asian Americans to seek support. Okay, we also have some gendered stereotypes. So for Asian American women, we have stereotypes like the Dragon Lady. This is a stereotype that's been around since the early days of silent cinema. The Dragon Lady is fierce and hypersexual. She is mysterious, often evil and villainous. One of the first Dragon Ladies is Anna May Wong over here on the left. She played the daughter of Fu Manchu in a lot of movies, would assist in his deadly plots. And we can see this stereotype today in all of these roles for Asian American women or Asian women, where they're also violent and deadly, or using their hypersexualized bodies to gain power. And the counterpart to this is Asian women as the lotus blossom, who is submissive and gentle and delicate. She's also hypersexualized. She's also like a prize to be won by a man, usually the male hero, as you can see in a lot of the examples that I've put here. So beyond being this like beautiful girlfriend and sexual partner, a lot of plots also revolve around her being helpless and in need of saving because she can't take action for herself. And then a lot of times she has to die at the end of the film, like that the film is, or the story, actually it shows up in plays too, that she so needs help and so needs saving and is so submissive that she will sacrifice herself so that the male hero can move on with his life or find happiness and success. Okay, so let's talk about the consequences of these stereotypes for Asian Americans. Obviously, at a basic level, we can say it doesn't feel good to be stereotyped. No one likes to be put into a box or have people feel like it's okay to make very limiting assumptions about who you are just because of how you look or what people think they know about you. Asian Americans are very tired of being made to feel like they have to explain that they do belong in the US or that English is their first language. Asian Americans want everyone to know that they have their own individual stories and interests and everything else. But what I really wanted to remind us about is how these stereotypes have led to anti-Asian violence. So unfortunately, there are also long histories of Asians being attacked for just trying to live their lives. I've got Vincent Chin here on the left. He was not the first victim of an anti-Asian hate crime, but he was one of the first Asian American one of the first times that Asian American communities really rallied behind a cause together and tried to call attention to how racism was played into his murder. So Vincent Chin was a Chinese American who was partying with his friends in Detroit right before his wedding. It was like a bachelor night party, but this was during a time when the auto industry in Detroit was really suffering from the rise of Asian imports. So these two angry white men attacked him, saying that it was because of him that they were out of work, and they beat him with a baseball bat and he died. So Asian American civil rights lawyers fought really hard to call this a hate crime, but the two men who killed him were only convicted of manslaughter and they never even had to go to jail. So this brutality and injustice was seen as a huge call to action for Asian Americans. But of course, it was kind of just the beginning of all of these struggles. We should also remember that all of the attacks on South Asians and Arab Americans and Muslims after 9/11. And then I also have an image here of the attack on the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin in 2012, where 6 Indian Americans were killed. Right, so all of these are really important stories for us to remember that stereotypes have an impact on people's actions. So in the last year, we have also seen a really horrific surge in violence against Asian Americans that we think is connected to the pandemic. So this group called Stop AAPI Hate has documented over 6,000 hate incidents in the last year. So this includes things like verbal assaults, civil rights violations, physical assaults, and most of these are taking place in public places or businesses. A lot of the attacks are centered on Chinese Americans. A lot are also on women, though other ethnic groups and genders are also included. So here are some examples. In February, an unidentified person slashed a 61-year-old Filipino man across the face on the subway. An Asian 64-year-old woman was robbed outside a Vietnamese market. A 19-year-old pushed Vicha Ratanapakdi, an 84-year-old Thai man, to the ground, and he died 2 days later from the injury. A person pushed a 91-year-old Asian man to the ground in Chinatown. This is just a small collection of the kinds of violence that we're seeing. And then I also want to look closely at the mass killings in Atlanta to see how violence is connected to these same histories and stereotypes in that case. I'm sure you all remember this, but in March, a man went on a shooting spree in Atlanta where he specifically targeted Asian-owned businesses, and he killed 8 people. 6 of them were Asian women. I have their names here. The way that this issue was discussed in news media immediately following the shooting, I think shows us the consequences of the stereotypes that I've been talking about here. So let's look at some of these headlines and think about their connection to these stereotypes. Okay, so we've got Atlanta spa killings lead to questions about sex work and exploitation. So we can recall that it was automatically assumed that the Asian women who were murdered were sex workers, because that is such a common framework for understanding all Asian women. So we've got Atlanta shooting suspect told police he targeted massage parlors because of sex addiction. So then the white man who murdered all of these Asian women somehow becomes the center of the story. His voice and his take on what happened became the headlines. And he feeds into these same narratives of Asian women's hypersexuality. So it's this idea that like these sexy Asian women were just some kind of constant temptation for him, and that's what drove him crazy. So this idea of sex addiction was put forward as a justification for going on a killing spree. Here we have Atlanta spa shooting suspect Robert Aaron Long had a bad day before massacre, said the cops. This was a really weird narrative where the murderer was described as having had a bad day. So in these kinds of headlines and the orientation of these stories toward what this man was saying about his experiences, the stories of the Asian women who were murdered become just an afterthought. Like it's too hard to pronounce their names, or they were too different to understand or make sense of. And because of this, their lives and histories became invisible, which I explained is just what we have seen before. So the lives of Asian women have always been understood as disposable and less important than the lives of the white men who are obsessed with them. FBI director says Atlanta shooting does not appear racially motivated. So another problem with this story was that authorities were really quick to say it wasn't about race, even though it so obviously was. So we can connect this to how racism against Asian Americans is often seen as not as bad as anti-Black racism, which is part of a general move in media narratives toward colorblindness and post-racism. So it has been believed for a long time that the way to get rid of racism is to just stop talking about race so much. Like if we could act like people don't have a race, then, and race maybe doesn't matter anymore, somehow that would end hundreds of years of racial inequality that have been baked into every aspect of our society. This is not true at all. But when you take this belief alongside assumptions that Asian Americans are the model minority, that we've been conditioned to not call attention to our struggles and just keep our heads down, we've been rewarded for seen as apolitical and set aside from other racial groups, that's how it ends up seeming acceptable to say that 6 Asian women got killed while working at Asian-owned businesses, but somehow it's not about race. It's not about them being Asian women. And of course, the problem with that framing is that then this murder is not connected to all of the other violent issues of violence that I had just gone through, or the fact that we're in this moment where there's been this enormous surge in attacks on Asian and Asian Americans. Okay, so those are the problems with media representations and media narratives and their real life consequences. So now I want to move to how Asian Americans have fought back and challenged the way they've been talked about in the media. This is definitely an issue that's been getting a lot of news coverage in the past years, or past few years. There's been some prominent Asian American entertainers who have really spoken out about this. But I also want to go back further and talk about how this kind of work has been happening basically ever since the birth of the Asian American movement. So Asian Americans have always recognized how important media representations are and that we should organize as a community to improve them. So as early as the 1980s, Asian American activists were organizing to protest racist representations. So things like if they saw that Fu Manchu stereotype coming up again, or like Charlie Chan detective stories, different groups of Asian Americans would come together to protest them. But in 1991, a bunch of activists got together in Los Angeles because it was an anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and that the news stories that were happening around Pearl Harbor were leading to violence against Japanese Americans, kind of similar to what we're seeing now, where irresponsible reporting can have really horrible consequences. So these activists started the Media Action Network for Asian Americans. We have Mana over here. And their mission is advocating balanced, sensitive, and positive portrayals of Asian Americans. And they actually mostly focus on entertainment media. So they're still based in Los Angeles. When I was going to grad school in LA, I did a lot of research while working with them. So I would go to all their meetings and learn about all of their activism, and they were doing all sorts of cool stuff. Then this other organization I want to call attention to is the Asian Pacific American Media Coalition, and they award annual diversity report cards to the top 4 television networks. So they say how ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox are doing in terms of Asian Americans in front of the screen and behind the screen, so working in all sorts of positions. And then they have meetings with them and say, like, this is how we need to do better. Like, you're still messing up in this area, but this has been great, and try to get them to improve their hiring every single year. Mana actually had a really big win this spring because they had been, for 15 years, they had been telling Jay Leno that he needs to stop making jokes about derogatory jokes about Asians. He had been making all sorts of jokes where the punchline was that Asians eat cats and dogs. It was horribly offensive, and he never listened to this Media Action Network for Asian Americans. But then this spring, after the violence in Atlanta, he finally had a realization and apologized to Mana and other Asian Americans. So this was a really big victory for the group after all of these years of activism. There's also been the rise of a lot of professional organizations for Asian Americans who work in media. So we've got CAPE, the Coalition of Asian Pacifics in Entertainment, and the Asian American Journalists Association. So they can provide support kind of on the job. It can be networking and professional development, mentoring, that kind of thing. So for instance, when when all the Atlanta shootings happened, AAJA was on the front lines saying, journalists, this is how you're messing up, and this is how you can cover this story better. So it's really important to talk about these organizations because I think we should recognize that activists have been engaged in ground building, base building, and organizing on the ground for the last 30 years. And in that time, they have been able to build relationships with media producers and industry insiders so that their work is really respected, and they have a long track record of results. But another kind of activism, or another way that we've seen change happening, is through self-representation or Asian American media production. So also stretching all the way back to the rise of the Asian American political movement and Asian American identity formations, we have Asian Americans who picked up cameras and told their own stories. So there's actually, we would call it Asian American cinema, the rise of this kind of avant-garde film movement that came out of Los Angeles and New York in the 1970s and 1980s. And there were a lot of Asian American media arts organizations that supported this kind of work. And these organizations are still around today, but one of the other cool things that we see happening is the rise of more Asian American film festivals. So these are really celebratory events where the community can get together and watch media that was created by Asian Americans about Asian Americans that's for Asian Americans. Because what good is all this media production if no one has any place to screen it and watch it with their community? So we have a lot of these organizations that are focused on supporting this kind of work. And actually every year I program a series at UW-Madison's Cinematheque, and we screen Asian American documentaries and feature films. So I like to think that's part of this tradition. Here's a quote from filmmaker Tad Nakamura, whose dad, Robert Nakamura, was one of the founding filmmakers, who started a program at UCLA that teaches college students of color how to tell their own stories. And Tad points out how important that's been. He said, I always grew up knowing that Asian Americans made films and could make film, and there was a lot of them making films. So this comment is really important because it defies the Hollywood lore that there just isn't enough Asian American talent out there, or that we need to fill the pipeline before we can see any changes. I feel like maybe if I asked everyone who's here today, if you could name an Asian American director, maybe some of you couldn't. There aren't a lot of big name directors. Maybe you think of Ang Lee, or Chloe Zhao just won an Academy Award, but there really aren't a lot of high profile Asian American filmmakers in Hollywood. So you have to look back at these kinds of Asian American organizations and events to be able to get to this mentality that Tad has, this reality that there actually are a lot of Asian American media makers. You just have to know where to look. All right, the last kind of activism that I want to talk about is digital activism. And we have seen the rise of this, obviously, since social media has been invented. This kind of activism can grow very fast and make a big impact. Sometimes it's really well organized, like these groups. Sometimes it's kind of ad hoc, but either way, it can still be effective. For instance, we've seen a big push in activism that promotes buying movie tickets for Asian American films. There's this group of Asian American entrepreneurs who came together under the name Gold House, and they organize promotional campaigns that they call Gold Opens. So that's why I have this hashtag Gold Open. So they pick Asian American movies like these and then they try to get them to have big opening weekends. So like tons of tickets sold on these films opening weekends, because that kind of data is really important in determining the success of a film. They were particularly successful with the movie Crazy Rich Asians. They got a whole bunch of celebrities and Asian American community leaders to buy out entire theaters. And that became part of the narrative of that film's success. It was, there's all these news articles that said Asian American communities are coming out in droves to support this film and opening their pocketbooks to support the movie. Here's a tweet where he says, every movement needs its mafia. That's why 100 of us have bought out theaters to give Crazy Rich Asians a gold open. And this one is sold out, Crazy Rich Asians. So this is a really good way to show support in the way that media industries actually care about, which is at the box office. There are other ways that digital activism can have an impact just by starting new conversations or challenging norms. And just one example of this, I'm sure we could think of many, many hashtags that do this work, but here's an example of this one called hashtag starring John Cho. So this is basically just an art project. There was this man named William Yu. He's a social media professional, and he photoshopped John Cho's face into a whole bunch of popular movies. And it basically is asking the question, why can't an Asian American actor like John Cho be a movie star? I think this idea of Asian Americans as movie stars has kind of been unimaginable. But so much of that is just because they weren't given a chance. So these images and this hashtag got a lot of attention, and they started a lot of really productive conversations like, that's right. What a strange situation where John Cho is not considered for a leading romantic role or as someone who could be in a Marvel movie or like starring in his own movie. And since then, we have seen many changes with Asian American romantic leads. And I think next summer we're going to have an Asian American Marvel movie. So this is very inspiring. We've also seen a really big problem with whitewashing, which is basically the idea that we've seen a problem where white actors are taking roles away from Asian actors. So for instance, in the movie Aloha, Emma Stone was cast to play this role of this woman whose name is Allison Ng, and she's supposed to be part Native Hawaiian, but Emma Stone is white. Here's some other examples of this. So we've got Scarlett Johansson cast to play Motoko Kusanagi in Ghost in the Shell, or Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One in Doctor Strange, or this white man, Finn Jones, cast as the Iron Fist. So these are really complicated stories. The directors all have their reasons for why they chose these certain actors, but basically, we could imagine that these roles could have been for Asian Americans, and they could have been like starring vehicles for Asian Americans. And so Asian Americans were very vocal and critical on social media, and they got a lot of directors to apologize. So it took some time, but after much pressure from social media, Cameron Crowe apologized for casting Emma Stone as an Asian American. And recently, Marvel's Kevin Feige admitted fault with Doctor Strange in this whitewashing scandal. So of course, getting these apologies is really important. It shows that Asian Americans are getting their point across and being taken seriously. I mean, think how terrible it would be if someone wouldn't even apologize because they don't understand that anything was done wrong. Of course, the next step is seeing what changes can be made in future casting. So we have kind of yet to see what will happen in the future. There's a lot of different possibilities for this, but those are just some of the different ways that Asian Americans have organized to change representations in the media and why I think it is so important. This is a really exciting time to be paying attention to this because there are a lot of changes that are happening really rapidly. But hopefully this kind of historical perspective also shows why we have to keep working on this issue and how deep the problem is and how important it is to not give up. So that is all I have for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lopez. Does anybody have any questions for Professor Lopez?